And now in a post-COVID world, I think it is at least post-COVID-ish. Like, what are some of the glaring issues that we're facing? Is it something like the teenage mental illness and suicide issues? Is it what are the big things on your radar that really you want to talk about with a book like this to get people's attention that something's not right here, something's not normal?
Well, you began your question by referring to teenage mental health. The the number of children being diagnosed with all manner of mental health conditions is going up on both sides of the Atlantic. The New York Times, I think 4 weeks ago now, as we speak today, had a front page headline article about a teenager who was on 10 different psychiatric medications, if you can believe it. 10.
10.
That's inexcusable. It shows the utter bankruptcy of the psychiatric system. That rather than looking at the root sources of why this teenager is having her angst and her difficulties, that you just keep trying to soothe the symptoms by adding more pharmacology. 10 different medications. Nobody should be on 10 different psychiatric medications. Nobody in the world should be on 10 different psychiatric medications. The rise in childhood suicides, the articles, at least on this side of the Atlantic, but I know in Britain it's the same case. Um, Articles in the New York Times and the New Yorker wringing their hands about the alarming rise in childhood suicides. But the conversation always takes place without any mention of trauma, which is the fundamental dynamic in all of these conditions. And so on the one hand, we're desperate over the rising tide of mental distress that's besetting our youth. On the other hand, we're not looking at the causes, and that's one of the intentions of our book is to look at, well, what's really going on here.
Let's talk about trauma a little bit because I distinctly remember you being here in London 4 or 5 years ago when we sat down and we were talking about I'd gone to run an Ironman race and my nemesis on the race was John Joseph, and he had suffered some childhood sexual abuse, and I was kind
Yeah.
of revisiting some of the issues of my parents getting divorced when I was 7. And I remember
Yeah.
I casually remarked to you, Gabor, I said, well, my trauma was nowhere near as bad as John Joseph's trauma. And you said, hold on,
Yeah.
Brian, that's not true. Because if you didn't properly, I think, process it mentally, it's very hard to quantify trauma. You know, you might say, well, this was an act that seems more damaging than this. But, you know,
Yeah.
you had a great way of trying to explain trauma. And I know in the book you talk about a capital T and maybe a small t trauma. Did I understand what you were saying to me right? And how do you kind of talk about or explain trauma to people?
Yeah, I think you got it. The first principle to understand is that trauma is not what happens to you. So if you look at John Joseph's case, in your case, you might say, oh, well, he was really traumatized. I wasn't, because you're looking at what happened to you. But trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happens inside you. So trauma actually comes from a Greek word for wound. So trauma is the wound that you sustain. It's not the hit, it's the concussion, you know, and everybody reacts differently to external events. So first of all, trauma is the internal wound. That's the first point. The second point is an exercise they often do with people. When they think back to their own childhoods, they don't see it as a big deal, but then have no standard of comparison. But your parents, when they got divorced, and I forgot what conversations we may have had around that, but your parents, when they got divorced, they didn't all of a sudden wake up from a happy marriage and say, sweetheart, it's been wonderful, goodbye. There would have been years of tension, you know, and maybe, I don't know what happened in your family, but I mean, I know what happened in my marriage, you know, and there's a lot of tension in a home which ends in divorce. Now, if you take one of your children and plug them, just imagine with your home, with your spouse, that same degree of tension or rancor, unhappiness that led to your parents' divorce. Imagine one of your children living in that environment for years. Would you still dismiss it as no big deal? You know, clearly you would say, this child, I wouldn't want my child to go through that degree of difficulty. So we tend to dismiss our own experience as irrelevant when we compare it to others. But there's no comparing trauma, because trauma is not what happens. It's the wound that you sustain inside. And when you mention the small t and the big T, sexual abuse is what you call a big T trauma. You know, I mean, that just really hurts. But you can have the wound sustained, especially by sensitive kids, in homes where nobody abused them, but they didn't meet their needs for emotionally being seen and understood. Maybe they had to deal with a parent who was depressed, or a parent who was just emotionally unavailable, like I was to my kids, and those kids are still wounded. So again, trauma is that wound. It's not the event. And from that point of view, it's almost irrelevant. Although I do delineate the big tree from the small tree, in practice, the degree of wounding, it's almost irrelevant to make those distinctions.
Yeah, you really taught me that, because when my parents got divorced when I was 7, I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it at the time. Therapy wasn't a thing. There were, nothing online obviously back then, and I think I was just left to kind of stew in my own issues. And my personality was different than my brother, who was 2 years older than me, than my sister, who was 4 years younger than me. We all dealt with it in our own way. And for me, it was just to believe that I could never trust anybody in the world, that it was just going to be me against everything else. I had to be self-reliant. I couldn't rely on anybody.
So just imagine for a moment, one of your children in that situation, how your heart would break for them, And that was your situation, And it's the situation of a lot of children in our society.
Yeah.
The greedy bankers are about to do it again. In 2008, they crashed our financial system and nearly bankrupted the entire global economy. Then they received trillions of dollars in government bailouts. And after, they demanded fat bonuses paid for by you, the taxpayer.
It turns out the banks haven't just been screwing the American taxpayers, they're also screwing over their investors. Turns out the banking industry is the worst place you could put your money, despite enormous taxpayer bailouts.
Now the bankers are back to take away your financial freedom. They lie and tell you that cryptocurrency isn't safe. They try to make it illegal for you to choose how to invest your hard-earned money. They lie and say cryptocurrency is used by money launderers and criminals. But look at the record. It's the banks themselves that launder hundreds of billions of dollars every year to the biggest criminal operations in the world.
Leaked documents have revealed how some UK banks have helped criminals, money launderers and Russians under sanctions.
American authorities discovered that the Sinaloa cartel moved $881 million through HSBC accounts as bank officials turned a blind eye to the illegality.
The bankers lie and say cryptocurrency is not a real investment. Meanwhile, the smartest CEOs in the world are buying billions and billions of it. The truth is that banks lie about cryptocurrency because it makes them scared. The banks take $9 trillion per year of your hard-earned money, and they are worried that they will finally be exposed. They're scared because crypto means they can no longer control your money, which means they can no longer control you. They are scared because you might actually understand your money and intelligently decide what to do with it. Now is the time for us to come together, fight back, and take control. It's time to educate ourselves, our families, and our communities. Because financial education means financial freedom. We know that cryptocurrencies will help us build the new decentralized financial system of the future. A banking system that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. A banking system where access to finance is a fundamental human right. A banking system that is free and fair and welcomes all humans on this earth. The DeFi revolution is happening. We, the people, can no longer be fooled. We choose to take control of our finances. We choose to take control of our freedom. We choose to take control of our future. Join us, and let's take back our financial freedom forever.